Today I'm going to talk about Symfony 4. It's brand new. Beta 1 was released yesterday. And I released yesterday just because I wanted to demo Symfony 4 today. So, yeah. I'm not going to talk about the new features of Symfony 4 because there are plenty of documentation online. You can go to symfony.com/blog. We have a series of blog posts about the new features, or the major ones, actually. Today I want to talk about one big change that we did in Symfony 4, and it's not about code, it's not about features, it's about the experience of using Symfony 4. And I think that's very important because the way you are going to develop with Symfony 4 is very different from the way you are developing with Symfony 3 or Symfony 2. And the thing is, if you have a look at the code base and the BC breaks, there aren't so many BC breaks actually. So if you are using Symfony 3 today, you can upgrade to Symfony 4 quite easily. You just need to fix all the deprecation notices and you can upgrade. So it should be easy, I would say. The big difference is more about how you can use Symfony. So if you are starting a new project, then you can use it. You can use Symfony 4 as you were using Symfony 3. That's totally possible. But I would recommend to use the new way of doing things. Okay, so can't see anything here. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the default way of managing a Symfony 3 application. So you create a new application and you want to add some dependencies. Most of the time, a dependency is a bundle. So you want to add a bundle to add some kind of feature. So how can you do that with Symfony 3? You can do, okay, just 2 seconds because I can't see anything. So I'm gonna mirror my screen, very fast, management, display. Okay, so you are using Composer for that. You require a bundle. Here we are using Easy Admin Bundle. That's the very first step. But then you have additional steps to make it work. So the second step is enabling the bundle. So you need to edit a file, add the bundle name. You need to figure out what the class name is. So probably it's in the README or documentation. That's the very first step. That's required, actually. Then, sometimes you need to add some route configuration. That's the case for Easy Admin. And then, you need to configure the bundle. And again, most of the time, you copy and paste something that you find in the documentation, the default configuration to get started. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work, and if you want to remove the bundle because you are not using it anymore, then you need to undo everything by hand. So you need to remove the configuration, you need to remove the routing system configuration, disable the bundle, and so on. So that's a lot of work, and work that can be automated, or at least I think it can be automated, and actually it's automated in Symfony 4. And so that's the first problem I wanted to solve with Symfony 4. How can we make that much easier when you want to add some kind of features? Here I'm talking about when you add a bundle, but the same goes when you are adding a dependency, a Composer dependency that is not a Symfony bundle. The other problem I wanted to solve is distributions. So we have this notion, and actually it's not really used in the wild, but we have several distributions. So the most famous one is the Symfony Standard Edition, and if you start a project today, you will probably use the Standard Edition. We have a few other ones The Hello World edition, it's not a great one because it's really just about demonstrating the performance of an Hello World Symfony application. Not really useful. You have the CMF Standard Edition and the REST edition. I think that's pretty much it. So, and we don't have distributions because it's probably not the right abstraction. So a distribution is really the Symfony full stack framework and then a set of bundles pre-configured for you, depending on the edition. Okay, sorry. So, to be able to fix that, I worked on SymfonyFlex. SymfonyFlex is a composer plugin that helps you fix the problems I've just talked about. So it hooks into the lifecycle of the composer require command to do things automatically for you. So we'll see how that works. So a quick summary of all the versions of Symfony. So Symfony 1 was really just a monolith. So it was a big monolith and not really decoupled, so you get everything and you can't really remove anything. Symfony 2 is a bit different because we also introduced some decoupled components. So if you have a need for a console tool, for instance, you can just use the Symfony console component without getting everything else from Symfony. So it was a bit better, but still, by default, when you create a new application with Symfony 2, you get everything from the Symfony/Symfony repository. Symfony 3 is really just about the marketing things. So we introduced the notion of a micro framework kernel, but it's really just a single class, and sorry about that, Ryan. But it's really just about marketing, right? Yes. But the great thing is that it was the first step towards a better Symfony. And Symfony 4, now, it's really the decoupled components, but also the micro framework style application, and we'll see that it's a reality, it's just not about being a marketing thing. And a platform. A platform means that you can use Symfony for any kind of application, not just web applications like it was the case with Symfony 1, 2, and 3. So here is how you can install a Symfony 3.2 application. You create that with the Symfony installer. So that's a small binary that you can download from symfony.com. And you say that you want to create a new microservice application. So it downloads Symfony. It downloads the Symfony Standard Edition, actually, and then it tells you what to do to get started. The problem is that it uses the Symfony Standard Edition, which means that it comes with some dependencies that you might want or might not want, depending on the kind of application that you are developing. So for instance, it comes with Doctrine by default. It comes with Swift Mailer, for instance, but if you are not going to send emails, or if you don't care about Doctrine because you don't have a database for your application, then you need to manually remove all those dependencies before getting started. Which means that depending on your application, you have too many dependencies out of the box, or too few if you are developing, say, let's say, an API and you want to use API platform. You need to require that before getting started. So the sweet spot of the Symfony Standard Edition is when you want to develop a traditional web application with a database and a front end written in PHP and Twig. But that's not the case anymore, because nowadays I want to be able to use Symfony for all kinds of applications. So traditional web applications, of course, but also microservices applications or APIs or web services, whatever. And the Symfony Standard Edition is really trying to cover everything, even if that's not really the case, right? So that doesn't work. And that's why I was saying that distributions is probably the wrong abstraction. So I wanted to find something else, another way to actually fix this issue. And this issue is but even worse, because so you can remove doctrine, you can remove Swift mirror bundle. Takes some time, but that's possible. But you can't remove anything coming from the Symfony/Symfony repository. It's one big repository, so you can't do anything about that. So if you don't need the form subsystem, for instance, you get it. Is it a problem? Probably not. It's all about the perceived complexity of the solution. So you get a lot of things by default. It is an issue because we can't know if you are using the form subsystem or not. As it comes by default, we can't know if you are going to use it or not, which means that by default, the form subsystem or translation or a lot of different packages, by default, they are enabled, even if you're not using them. And it's your responsibility to actually disable them if you're not using them. And I bet that most of you are not doing that, which means that performance-wise, it's not optimal. Right? Okay, so yeah, so some examples. So by default, you get a lot of files and lines of code under the bundle directory out of the box when you are using the Symfony Standard Edition. Okay, so again, Symfony 4, we try to optimize for microservices style applications by default. And if you want to get the monolith, that's also possible with Symfony 4, but that's not the default anymore. The great thing about SymfonyFlex, and I'm going to talk about SymfonyFlex in a minute, is that we can remove a lot of concepts that you need to grab and you need to understand with Symfony 2 and Symfony 3. So we don't need a Symfony Standard Edition anymore. We don't need a Symfony full stack framework anymore, even if it's there just for the contributions, because it's easier. We don't need a Symfony installer anymore, and the distribution bundle is not needed anymore. So all those things are obsolete now in Symfony 4, and we are not using them in Symfony 4. So before talking about Symfony 4 and the SymfonyFlex automation, I want to talk about the directory structure. And again, it's not that important, but the perceived complexity or the perceived way of doing things depends a lot on the directory structure and where you are actually storing your code. So that's Symfony 2, 3, and 4. We made some changes. So for instance, we tried to get less subdirectories. So for instance, the config directory, it was under app, so it was app config. Now it is just config. We renamed things like web to public because most projects out there are using public. Open source projects are using public, so it's kind of nice. And we tried to move everything that is PHP code under the source directory. So today in Symfony 3, you get some PHP files under the app directory. I can tell you why it was done that way, but for Symfony 4, we decided to have only PHP code under the source directory. Everything else, everything that is not PHP, is outside of the source directory. So resources, for instance, they are not in the source directory anymore. Okay, so we're going to talk about that a bit more later on. That's the major changes. You can see new files like the environment.env here. So it replaces, it does not replace the parameters.yaml file. It's really just about things that can change between environments. So for instance, your doctrine DSN, the URL to connect to doctrine, is different on your laptop and on your production server. So it probably makes sense to create an environment variable for that kind of stuff. But please don't put everything under the .env file. That's not wise. Okay, we did some small changes, but they are very significant, I think. So the most important one, I would say, is the routes.yaml file. It was named routing.yaml before. Routing is really the notion of of more than just configuring the routes. So the fact that now it's named routes.yaml, I think it's easier to understand what you need to put in these files. So we did some tweaks like that. That's really about small things, but I think especially for newcomers, it's going to be much easier to understand the directory structure of Symfony and the different files. So as I said, less subdirectories, it's easier to navigate. Non-PHP files are not under the source directory anymore. And one nice thing is that it's more decoupled from Symfony, because your assets, your templates, before they were under a resource directory, under a bundle, so it was really tied to Symfony. It's not the case anymore. Now your templates, they go under a templates directory, assets under assets, and translation under translations directory, and so on. So it's nice because you can reuse those templates without using Symfony if you want. That's totally possible if you are using Twig, of course. Okay. The next significant change is in the way you're going to develop with Symfony 4. And actually there is, there is no issue here. So in Symfony 2, the best practice was to actually create several bundles for your application, depending on the goal of the bundle. So you would have a product bundle, a user bundle, and so on. But it's only nice if you can say, okay, the user bundle is decoupled from the product bundle. As soon as there is a dependency between the two, or a bidirectional dependency between the two, there is no point in having two different bundles. So having bundles like that is nice if you can reuse the bundle in several applications. But from my experience, that doesn't work. And people, they don't know when to create a new bundle versus having one big bundle with everything inside. So it was a nightmare to decide where to put things. That's why in Symfony 3, we advocate to use just one app bundle. That's all. That's better. It's simpler to understand as well. If you have multiple bundles, sometimes you need to figure out, okay, this feature is part of which bundle? I don't remember. So that's a nightmare. You need to look under all your bundles. It's not nice. And you have a lot of subdirectories. In Symfony 4, we went one step further and we removed the app bundle, which means that your application does not need to create a bundle anymore. You can if you want, but that's not a requirement anymore. And again, it means less subdirectories, and it's nicer as well because the namespace is shorter. So by default, the namespace is app. So for instance, for the product controller that you have here, the namespace would be app controller. That's all. Much easier to understand. So I converted a lot of applications from Symfony 2 to Symfony 4, and that's very nice. That's very nice. Especially for applications that you don't manage on a day-to-day basis. For instance, the Symfony.com website, we don't make that many changes all the time. And now it's really easy to understand all the controllers that we have versus we had 4 different bundles before. And for instance, we had a marketing bundle and a content bundle. Not good. You never know if the content is in content bundle or marketing bundle. Anyway, so your code is not longer divided into bundles. The namespace, by default, that's app. You can change it. I would not recommend you to do that, but that's totally possible if you want. And if you want to change it, then you can edit the composer.json file. That's where you can configure that. Tests are now under their own test directory, not under the source directory anymore, like what we are doing with Symfony as well. And by default, we don't give you all the files that you get from the Symfony Standard Edition, so we only have one front controller. So whenever you deploy, you don't need to remember to remove the app_dev.php file. yeah, it should be easy to do, but many people don't do that. So now it's not a problem anymore. You only have one front controller. And that's possible because now we have environment variables. So the configuration under the front controller in index.php, depending on the value of app.env and app.debug, we can configure the kernel differently. It's also possible because if you have a look at the difference between app.php and app_dev.php, you will see that most of the things are not relevant anymore in Symfony 4. We add a lot of optimizations for the class loader in Symfony 3. It's not needed anymore in Symfony 4 because we switched to PHP 7 and it's not a problem anymore. So we were able to simplify the code a lot, which means that at the end of the day, the script for the development environment and the production environment, they were almost the same. So we decided to move everything into one front controller. That is, and actually, if you have a look at the real one, that's not the real one, it is quite short. Okay, how can you configure Symfony 4? So again, that's a bit different. The main difference is that because we automate configuration and default configuration, we can't really manage one big config file with everything inside. So we decided to split the config file into smaller chunks of configuration. Basically, one configuration file per bundle or package. It's not really just about bundles. That's why it's named config packages and not config bundles, by the way. And again, routes versus routing, and .yaml with an A, which is the standard. Okay. Okay. To enable bundles, it's not done in app kernel.php anymore, just because we need to automate that and be trying to change a PHP file class is not that easy. So now we have a dedicated bundles.php file where you can configure your bundles or enable them. So this is just a list of bundles and the environments you want to enable them. So all means all environments. Most of the time, you don't need to change this file. You can, but you should not. And as I said before, now we have one configuration file per bundle. So basically, trying to split the config file into different configuration. Okay, if you want to, okay, this one is, so, and then we have subdirectories for configuration settings that depend on the environment. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this one now. We also tried to make it easier to configure things for cloud environments. And most of them are using environment variables. So that's why we have the .env file in Symfony 4. And as you can see, it's also more compact because most of the time, we switched from being very verbose, so configuring for the database, the auth port, the name, username, and the password with just one DSN string, which plays very nice with cloud environments. That's what you get most of the time. So that's the big difference here. Okay. Oh, by the way, you can use DSNs in Symfony 3 as well, but that's not the default when you get the Symfony Standard Edition. Okay, so switching from the development environment or switching the debug flag now is managed by environment variables as well, which means that we were able to actually optimize the front controller. But, oh, okay, I don't have a slide yet. But the thing is, so, okay, I'm going to talk about, I have a slide. I thought it was there, but it's not yet. So everything I've just talked about is not just about Symfony 4. That's the default with Symfony 4, but you can do the exact same thing on Symfony 3.3 and 3.4 projects if you want. Not a problem. So if you are starting a new project today, Of course, I would recommend you to use Symfony 4, but if you want to use Symfony LTS, so Symfony 3.4, you can do the exact same thing. And Flex is actually compatible as of Symfony 3.3. But I will recommend 3.4. So, Symfony Flex is the new way to create and manage Symfony applications. You will never interact with Flex directly. So that's something that is behind the scenes. You don't care about Symfony Flex. It's there, it's working for you, but you don't need to interact with Flex directly. So it replaces the Symfony installer, and it's optional. I'm not sure everybody will not use it. I think everybody is going to use it, actually. So it's optional, but I don't see why someone would not want to use it, really. Okay, so it works as of Symfony 3.3, and it's going to be default as Symfony 4. So in Symfony 3.4, you can also use the Symfony Standard Edition. We did that because Symfony Flex requires PHP 7, and Symfony 3.4 works with PHP 5.5, so it was not possible. That's a shame. Anyway, so the way it works is that when you require a package like Symfony Console, so by default, without Flex, there is a request to Packagist to get the URL where you can get the package, and then it goes to GitHub to download the package. With Symfony Flex, so if you require Symfony Flex, then it's a bit different. So if you require Symfony Console, then, so it goes to Packages to get the URL, it gets the package from GitHub, and then there is an additional request to the Symfony Flex server to get a recipe. A recipe is how to configure the package for Symfony. And we'll see what that means. So here I require doctrine, and you can see at the end Symfony operations, 3 recipes, and you can see that it configures things from recipes for the last 2, and it auto-generated a recipe for the doctrine cache bundle. So that's Symfony Flex. And okay, there is another thing. When you require doctrine, that doesn't mean anything. That's not a package name. So that's resolved by Symfony Flex as well. And when you say you want to require doctrine, we have a Symfony ORM pack which installs the Symfony doctrine bundle by default. So that's nice. So without Flex, again, when you create a new project, it does the exact same thing. So you're using, okay, if you are not using Symfony Flex, you need to use the Symfony command to create a new project. With Symfony Flex, you are just using Composer, regular one. So you create the Symfony skeleton. So Symfony skeleton is actually the base package. So that's the equivalent of Symfony Standard Edition. But if you have a look at the repository, you will see that it's just about one file, the Composer JSON file. That's it, nothing else. And then you give it your project name. Okay. So if you have a look at the code under the vendor directory for Symfony 4, or that's for Symfony 3.4 actually, that's the number of files and lines that you get under the vendor directory. That's 70% less code than with Symfony Standard Edition. So the big difference is that you get way less dependencies. Right? So that's what you get with Symfony 3.3. And if you are using Symfony 4, it's even less than that. As you can see, we don't have bridges anymore. We have just the framework bundle, which is really the glue between all the components. We have Flex, of course, and you have a few other things that are required for a web application or an HTTP application. I would say HTTP Foundation, HTTP kernel, and so on. There is one more that go, which is Symfony Console. So I did not update the slides. I did update this one. That's the default dependencies. So that's the file that you have in the Symfony skeleton repository. So you can see SymfonyFlex console framework bundle, YAML for configuration file, and .env to manage your .env file in development. Okay, if I want to install a bundle, the Redis bundle, the first step, I require a bundle, the bundle, so that's without Flex. Then I need to enable it. Then I need to change some parameters to get it work correctly. Then some default configuration, done. With Flex, you require the same bundle, done. And that's why I was saying that you don't interact with Flex. It does everything for you. It just works. Okay, so okay. And if you want to install the bundle, Flex does everything for you. So it's all about automating things. So it works because we have a server with recipes. So that's the recipe for the Redis bundle. So you can see that we ask Flex to register a bundle for our environments. We ask it to copy some files from the recipe. That's the default configuration. And then we ask it to register some environment variables. So that's how you can configure your bundles automatically with recipes. Okay. So a recipe is really a package name and a version. So here, that's for version 2 of the bundle, which means that the recipe is going to work for all version 2 and 3 if I don't create a new recipe for version 3. Right. We have two different recipes repositories. The first one is the official one. Oops. The official one, so Symfony/recipes. And the second one is recipes-contrib. And there, you're free to submit a pull request for any bundle really out there, open source of course. But I'm going to demonstrate that now. Do you want me to do a small demo?
Sure.
You know it's not going to work, right?
We're hoping.
So to make it more interesting, I'm going to try Symfony 4, right? So let's say composer project, create project, beta Symfony skeleton demo. If you are on the Wi-Fi, please stop doing downloading. Yes, that works. So we get the skeleton, and if we have a look at github/symfony/skeleton, it's really just about one file. That's all. But you can see that the output is a bit different from the regular composer one. So it installed some dependencies here, that's the default ones. And then you can see that SymfonyFlex did some configuration. So for SymfonyFlex, the console routing and framework bundle. And then you have a nice text telling you what to do next. So I'm gonna try that now. Demo. That works. Okay. So let's have a look at what we get. If I type composer show, you can see all the dependencies that we have. So it's really just about PSR interfaces, not that interesting. PSR again, some Symfony stuff. That's all. So it's really small. If we have a look at what we get here, the directory structure. So is it big enough? That's a yes.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to append everything here. So you can see the bin directory with console, the config files. If I open bundles, you can see that the framework bundle is registered. Routes with some defaults. Source directory without anything. The kernel is there now. It's not under config anymore. Public with only index.php. .env with the default variables here, and that's all. it feels like, when you work with Symfony 4 and Flex, it feels like you are working with Silex. And actually, I converted a few Silex websites to Symfony 4, and it feels exactly the same. Okay, so let's try to do something. So let's create a controller, for instance. Default controller.php. Okay, so the namespace is going to be app controller. Let's create a class default controller. You don't need to extend anything. Let's create an index. And let's return a Symfony response. No. Like this. Okay? I want to use annotations. So it's going to be the default page. So I need to use Symfony component routing annotation. Right. Yes, I should have an ID. Old school. Anyway, so the next step is to enable the routing for the controllers, and I'm using annotations, so I need annotations. They're not there by default, right? So I can do that with, and we can try if that doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work. Let's switch to that. Okay, still the other one. So I will say composer require annotations. That's an alias, right? A shortcut. So the first thing is, as you can see, it resolved the alias to Symfony, to Sensio framework extra bundle. It installs all the dependencies. It configured Sensio framework extra bundle for me, which means that, perhaps, I don't remember if I need to do that. Probably not. Anyway, it works. Right? I've done nothing, no configuration whatsoever, and you can see that now I have, under bundles.php, it is registered by default, automatically. And I have some default configuration or not. No, I don't have any configuration actually. So, okay. It was easy. Next step, I want to use Twig. Right? So I'm going to use Twig. I'll try to do that like this. Twig, render, that's not Twig. Render index.html.twig, something like that. Right? So if I refresh, it doesn't work, of course, because I don't have Twig. So again, require Twig, like this. Yes. And again, it's going to resolve the alias. It will figure out that I need Twig bundle. It installs the bridge as well. It works. No, it doesn't work, but I don't have any templates. But the thing is, because I've just installed Twig, now, all of a sudden, I have a template directory. It was not there before, right? But because I have Twig, now I need to create some templates, so it created that for me. So I just need to create index.html.twig and say hello. It works. A lot of things is happening behind the scenes because, of course, Twig, injecting Twig like that in an action, that doesn't work in Symfony 3, right? That doesn't work. What I can do is, if I have more than one action, if I want to do the same, but in the constructor, for instance, that works as well. See, it works. Now, let's say I depend on an app foo service like this. If I refresh, it doesn't work because app foo does not exist. I'm going to create that really quick. Foo.php. namespace app, class foo. That works. That's kind of magic, but it's not. Because everything is configured under the services.yaml file. Not going to talk about that because there is talk about this specific file just after me. And how much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? That's great. So it works because everything is auto-wired automatically by Symfony. If it can do that for you, it's going to do that for you. Which means that developing with Symfony 4 is much faster. Your productivity is going to be much better. Because requiring things is like a snap. It's really easy. And then using your code or code coming from bundles is much easier, much faster. There is nothing to configure, nothing to think about. Just use your thing and you're done. Yeah.
Just real quick question. You mentioned that you can customize the bundles file if you wanted to. Does Flex respect your customizations?
Yeah, sure. Because so Flex only does installation and removal. That's all. So all the files under the packages directory, that's your files. You do whatever you want. That's just the default. That's just a sensible configuration, default configuration. But then, if you want to do things, it's up to you to change that. One nice thing is that right now, forms are not enabled because the Symfony form package is not installed. But if I compose or require Symfony form, then they will be enabled automatically without changing anything in the configuration. So you can say, here I can say form true or whatever it's like, or like this, whatever. I'm going to have an error because forms are not there. But if I do nothing, it's going to be enabled based on the fact that form is the form component is installed or not, which is really nice. And it's the same for annotations, for instance. You don't need to configure annotations. It's done automatically. I'm going to switch back to the slides now. Wanted to give you some tips about things you need to be aware of. So the first one is, it's not true anymore, I think. Actually, yes, it's true. Yeah. So you need to upgrade SymfonyFlex on a regular basis because the protocol is going to change. I know one thing that is going to change, and that's the way we manage aliases, actually. So the endpoint is going to be different in the next couple of days. So you need to upgrade. So we keep the old endpoints, but if you want to get the new features, you want to upgrade that on a regular basis. The second one, if you want to discover the recipes that are available, you can go to symfony.sh, and the home page is all about all the bundles configured under the main repository and the config repository. So right now we have a bit more than 65 recipes. That's how you can also get all the aliases. So you can just search for annotations and you will see what it's going to install. So aliases, we have a bunch of them. So if you want to install monologue bundle, you can use any one of those things. It's going to work. Some more, so you can require the server, which is the Symfony web server bundle. Profiler, so you don't get the profiler by default. If you want to get all the debug tools, like the profiler and var dumper and things, you can require debug pack. So a pack is just a composer that requires a bunch of components or bundles. We have a bunch of them. We have doctrine pack. We have API pack for API platform. We have debug pack. And I think that's all. No, I think there's another one. I don't remember. If you want to require a Symfony dependency, you don't need a Symfony slash thing. So you can say require whatever, var dumper, for instance, or workflow, or whatever. It's going to happen in Symfony automatically for you. So packs, so API platform, debug, ORM, webpack, of course. Contribute recipes, that's really easy. So whenever you require a new package, on a Symfony 4 or Symfony 3.4 application and you need to manually do things, please contribute a recipe. It's really fast. We automatically check for problems in your recipe. So the validation is really quick, and then it's automatically merged whenever someone validates that the recipe is actually good enough. And that's for the contrib repository. For the main repository, you need at least 2 core team members to validate your change, to approve the change. There is also a nice way to test your recipe. So you submit a pull request, and then you can change the Symfony endpoint, and that's what you get in the pull request. The information that you need to know to actually test your change. So you change the Symfony endpoint, which means that for each pull request, we have a specific SymfonyFlex server just for you, so that you can test that it actually works. Okay, so everything is managed automatically. Simple bundles that don't need recipes. I don't think, if you remember, the first example was about Doctrine Cache bundle, and the recipe was automatically generated. So if it is just about enabling the bundle, you don't need a recipes for that. Flex is smart enough to know how to do that automatically for any bundle out there. If it's done the right way, but most of them are, so that's not a problem. Now the thing is, it must be a Symfony-bundle type under the composer.json file. That's not always the case. So if that's not the case, submit a patch upstream. If you want to install something that comes from the contrib repository, then you have a small warning telling you that's the contrib repository. It's not managed by a Symfony core team, or not just about the Symfony core team. And then you have the choice to install just this bundle, or you can say, okay, I want to accept any bundle coming from the contrib repository. And that's part of the composer.json. If you open the composer.json file, you will see auto contrib. It's false by default. If you switch that to true, then it's going to install without asking you anything. Oh, by the way, the small ID that you get here is not used yet. So it's part of all the requests to SymfonyFlex, but it's not used yet. One tip, and that's new in Symfony 3.4, you can cast your environment variables. Sometimes that's nice. Two very good examples here. That's new in Symfony 3.4. In Symfony 3, it's kind of a mess when you want to run the console in production, because so you have 2 ways. You can pass explicitly the environment and the node debug flag, or you can use environment variables. As of Symfony 4, you just use bin console. That's all. There is nothing to configure. So it's nice. You can use bin console in development or production without changing anything. It just works because the environment variables are there by default. Environment variables, they also work with PHP unit, and they are automatically registered as well. Right? I recommend you to install and require PHP unit bridge as early as possible, because if it's not the case, then you will have to add the environment variables yourself. Right? So it doesn't do that after the fact. There's a bit more than just that. So when you define environment variables, they are registered automatically in PHP unit if it's there, in .env, and we have quite a few other automations, so I did not demonstrate that, but we also manage the git ignore file for you, and a recipe can add more stuff in there, which means that here I can just say git init and git add dot, and it does the right thing. And as you can see, by default, we don't have that many files. Right? Okay. So if you want to have some services that are different in development environment or test environment, that's how you can do that. It's also pretty new. You can override templates directly under the templates directory. You don't need to do that under the config directory anymore. That's nice as well. That's the convention you need to use. if you want to require framework extra bundle, you need to use version 5, but as you saw in the demonstration, it does that by default. So, okay, the demo, we've done that already. And I think that's all for today. If you have any questions, would be more than happy to answer them. Yep.
So, is there a specific reason, and I'm assuming it probably is, that you decided instead of making the recipes part of the bundle code and you're serving them off one of your own servers as opposed to just being able to include it in the bundle?
Yeah.
What's the thinking behind that?
Yeah. So there are plenty of reasons. A lot, a bunch, really. I won't give you them all because you can find them on the Symfony/Flex repository. I've looked in the issue queue and you will learn more about that. But one of them is that it's not just about bundles. SymfonyFlex is able to configure any package. So for instance, there is a recipe for PHP unit. I don't want to submit a pull request for a Symfony recipe on the PHP unit repository. It's not going to be accepted. So that's one reason, that's a big one, but there are many other ones. Yeah.
So, do you have any plans for like private recipes?
Yes. So most of the time, that's the very first question. So I was like, really? It's not the first one?
Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm working on that. It's going to be available in the next couple of weeks, perhaps, beta version. And that's part of a new strategy. So I can talk about that for 20 minutes, perhaps. But we can talk about that if you want to. So I'm just going to say that it's not going to be free, but it's going to be available. And that's also one reason why we need a server, because we need to manage private repositories and private recipes and authorization. So I don't want anyone to be able to install your recipes for your specific bundles. So that's yet another reason for the server, actually. So if you are interested in testing that, send me an email or talk to me after the talk. Any other questions? Yeah?
About the .env file, how can you test both on a laptop, the dev and the prod environment?
Okay, so now that's very easy. Just edit the .env file, switch the environment to prod, the debug to false, done.
Okay, so you will have to edit the file anyway.
No. You can also set a real environment variable to override that as well. That works. Why would it be a problem to override the .env file?
That would be a problem. Just
yeah, I think the simplest way would be to edit the .env file and done. I think that's nicer than having to switch from app_dev to app PHP, and then for the console you also need to pass those flags and things. Here you only have to change one thing, and it works for all the console and the web. Okay? Okay, thank you very much. And if you want to test Symfony 4, please do so. We are in beta. We have a month and a half to fix all the bugs that we have introduced during the development phase. Thank you.